Oiskano. Welcome back to our afternoon session. My name is Alyssa Mount Pleasant. This year I'm a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute, where I'm finishing my historic study of a Haudenosaunee community in the post-Revolutionary War era. I'm a historian by training and a member of the faculty in Native American and Indigenous Studies at the University at Buffalo. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Robert Odawi Porter. He is a member of the Heron Clan of the Seneca Nation of Indians, who served as the 67th president of the nation. I first met Rob a number of years ago when I was a graduate student at Cornell University. And a quick aside about Cornell, for those of us in the Ivy League, we know that Cornell is the only university that offers a graduate program in Native American and Indigenous Studies. But moving on, back to Rob. Rob, at that time, when I met him, was directing the Center for Indigenous Law, Governance, and Citizenship at Syracuse University. His work at Syracuse, where he founded a research-based law and policy institute that focuses on indigenous nations and their interactions with settler colonial governments, is just one facet of his wide-ranging career in Indian law that began when he was a student here at Harvard Law School. In addition to serving as a tenured law professor and developing research centers at Syracuse and the University of Kansas School of Law, he has worked in tribal courts and legal systems, serving as Chief Justice for the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri, advising the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation of Kansas, and working as Attorney General of the Seneca Nation of Indians. He is the author of numerous law review articles. He has testified before the U.S. Congress, and he has served as an expert witness in matters before U.S. and tribal courts. Currently, he is a senior advisor at Dentons, the world's largest law firm. Rob Porter brings incredible depth and breadth of knowledge to our conversation today. This is knowledge developed through an inspiring legal career. It is also grounded in Haudenosaunee understandings of nation-to-nation relationships. The Seneca Nation is one of 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy who came together under the guidance of an individual known as the Peacemaker. The Peacemaker's leadership and vision united these nations, providing a framework for the people to unite in peace, power, and righteousness. Some of you may be aware of this form of governance, which is often described in English as the Great Law of Peace. This form of governance was in place when colonists first arrived in North America. The protocols that Haudenosaunee people practiced among themselves and with foreign tribal nations also shaped their diplomatic relationships with colonists. These protocols later informed interactions with the emerging United States government in the decades following the Revolutionary War. They were critical to the Treaty of Canandaigua, which was signed in 1794. This treaty, which reinforced the nation-to-nation relationship between the United States and the 6 nations, remains in effect to this day. And every November 11th, Haudenosaunee people gather in Canandaigua, New York, to celebrate and commemorate this treaty. It is incredibly significant to Haudenosaunee people. It is an agreement that the people struggled to negotiate during the difficult, tumultuous years of the early American Republic. And it is an agreement that Haudenosaunee people have labored to protect and enforce ever since. When we think of Native peoples and Native politics, the work we undertake in the present day is always linked to much longer, larger experiences and traditions. In the same way that the ancestors who negotiated treaty agreements with colonial governments did so with an eye to the past, to contemporary circumstances, and to emerging generations, so do the people at today's gathering. And it's very good to be here with all of you. This afternoon, Robert Porter will speak to some of the ways legal advocacy and legal education helps us all move forward. Rob Porter.
Nyawe, thank you very much. I'm very honored to have a chance to be here today. It was 30 years ago that I came here for law school, which seems an unbelievably long time ago. But I want to thank the Dean of Radcliffe Institute and the Harvard Native Program because it is always a great opportunity to get back to Cambridge and to have an opportunity to get back into this world of ideas and influence and the future. And to that extent, I really also want to just acknowledge the Native students who are here. When I've had a chance to speak on a university campus in the past, I think you've done tremendous things over the years, even though there's further to go here at Harvard. But when I was here 30 years ago, there wasn't much at all, and we were eating those crappy potlucks over at the education building with all the potato chips and stuff that we would bring. And I really am thankful for that, because the few Native students of us who were here at the time, 30 years ago, really needed each other. And the faculty members that we had to help us were very important. So I want to speak to the students a little bit today about some of the things I have to share. A little story about when I was running for office in 2010 as the candidate for president of the Seneca Nation. A couple of our elders were very, very worried and concerned about me. You were licensed by the state of New York, our most dreaded adversary. How can we trust you with the license of the state government? Well, that's a good question. I mean, I had to have that license to be the nation's attorney, but that didn't seem to be the problem. And one of them even said, well, I'll tell you what, I think I'm going to support you, but it's really an experiment to see what happens. So I have been thinking about that a lot over the years. And I think what it meant was that in many ways, I still think of myself as an experiment. I grew up in the Allegheny territory of our nation, and I wasn't the only kid who had a white father. It just felt that way in terms of the issues that I was dealing with. And my family was very well anchored in our community. My grandfather had been on the council for 40 years, was one of our just historic leaders on the council. My mother was our very first education director of our nation, and she had just terrible battles with people in the late 70s as she was trying to deal with education. And I didn't know anything about this at the time, being a kid, but this whole idea of being educated in our nation was an unbelievably two-edged sword, and for many people, really just a one-edged sword, a bad edge. Because everything that the colonists have ever done that was really driven in long-term agendas came through education, came through the boarding schools. And I think that the panelists that preceded me really did a great job at sort of laying the foundation of really the historic, and I can't cover 500 years of history, in this speech, nor could the earlier panelists. But I think that history is very much a part of who I became and who I am today. And so it was a struggle. It was very much a struggle. And I want to share that a little bit with you because there are certain episodes that happened in my life that really no one would ever believe that my tribe went through during the early years of my work with them. And then I want to try to pull out a little bit of meaning in relation to the work that I've been lucky enough to be able to do for my nation within the Seneca Nation, and some of the work that I've done over the years working in the outside legal and political system. So the very first journey with respect to my own personal life really came. I had some great professors at Syracuse where I went to school. I had my family. But to be the first Attorney General of the Seneca Nation when I was 28 years old wasn't an accident. And I largely forced myself on my tribal government, saying that, you know what, you paid for a good chunk of my education, and the whole idea was that we'd come back and work for the tribe. Well, here I am. I've been in a law firm for 3 years. I don't know everything by any means, but I want to help. And boy, it was hard to get a job working for my own nation. And it was for those of you who have a close proximity to tribal government politics, you know what I'm talking about. And it was hard, and I ended up doing some things that were somewhat unconscious about trying to get my time in front of the council and trying to find a way to get appointed. And eventually, the council approved my contract to be the Attorney General. I was approved 15-1, except there was no money attached to it. They said, well, someday we'll get some money and then we'll hire him. And I thought, these guys are so clever, you know? But I didn't stop. And I think that's where it was some combination of being stubborn and selfish and just directed, that I wanted to help my tribe. And I wasn't going to say no to that. And that really was a common denominator. But I tell you, working for my nation when I was that young made me realize how little I knew about my own nation and our legal history and our political history, but also how ill-equipped my American law school education down the road here had prepared me for working in that legal environment. The most significant thing that happened that really changed my life significantly was in 1992, our nation was really in war against the state of New York over the taxation of cigarettes in our territory. It's about a treaty right of free commerce. And our treaty that Alyssa mentioned earlier about the free use and enjoyment of our lands, our people take that very seriously, that we are not to be interfered with and that we negotiated our treaty at a time when we were equals with the United States, and but for us and our warriors, there would be no United States. That's how we remember that treaty and that history, as a deal. You leave us alone, we give you peace. And frankly, at the time, people negotiated that and discussed it in 1992. Well, and here's the way the legal thinking goes of the Seneca in conflict. Our treaty is with the United States. It's not with the state of New York, so we can go to war with them. And it was an unbelievably contentious time, but that's when I started to really see and learn about how power is used against Native people. Men, really men, with guns, who are surrounding your nation, trying to kill your economy. And I was in the middle of the negotiations, I was working with our officials, I was dealing with the governor's office, I was dealing with the state police, and it was a very formative experience, and it lasted in the span of a week, but ultimately we won. And the state, the police, the governor, and their entire apparatus of attack was withdrawn, and our people declared and succeeded in gaining a victory over the state at that moment. So ever since that time, I have been experimenting and trying to find the way in which the power of Native people can be galvanized and mobilized without actually having to block the New York State Thruway, without actually having to engage in that kind of disobedience and resistance, because we should have that power. We do have that power, and that power is needed on a day-to-day basis to help our nations. There were other more unfortunate experiences that happened during that first term when I was the Attorney General. And we had a civil war. And we had a civil war that by this sort of scale of humanity and this scale of what goes on in the world even today was not vast. But when Senecas kill each other, that's a civil war. And we had a terrible battle emanating out of an election process, and it was really about gambling, casinos, and the struggle for that, and the degree to which our people did not want that, but some did. And it was a terrible time, you know, to be there and to see what was happening. And it eventually, you know, culminated in some degree of peace, and my term had ended. But it was an awful thing. And when I started teaching at the University of Kansas, and my wife and I were there to start a new chapter of our lives, it really stimulated a lot of thinking. And my first article that I wrote was about the destructive force of the American legal system and the way in which people are pitted against each other, people in conflict, which really only makes it worse. But it doesn't solve problems or heal people or bring people together. And I still think about those things, although I don't often have a chance to work on it. But that really was a formative moment in having an opportunity in my life, a very rare moment, to be a law professor at an American university, to have the time, to have the ability to teach, to have the ability to think and write. And that's where I, too, for the first time, was exposed to the X-File, the secret master plan for Native people. And I'm 32 years old, and no one had ever really told me about the secret master plan. It's actually written about quite nakedly, you know, about the plan to exterminate the Indians. And it was shocking in a way that I hadn't learned that previously, but why would the American government, why would the American legal system really encourage its own people, much less the natives, to learn about things like the doctrine of discovery? There's much more to be had to keep people ignorant of these things than to explain to them, oh, we only hold title to this entire country by virtue of this fiction that the Christian nations somehow own this land because the savages are not considered to be real people. You know, that's an unbelievably shocking thing when you're a professor, you know, a student of the law, and you're trying to understand the logic and the reason and the legitimacy of it, and the entire legal system as it relates to Native people is founded upon a fiction. It's absolutely false. So for the law students in particular, Native students in general, and everybody for sure, don't forget that. And I can't say that it can be done and fixed tomorrow, but it is an important foundation to remember. Now, this whole thing about the experiment, so I grew up on our territory, the Allegheny Territory, and then somehow I got to Harvard, and I went to a Washington law firm, and then I went back home again, and I was there, and I went back out, back to the world of the law professors, and I went back again. And so it's a quest to find out what's the best path, what's the best way to try to make a difference. And right now, you know, I can't say that I know the answer for sure, but I'm doing it again. And when I ran for office as the president, it was the most challenging time, and I don't really sometimes know how I did it other than I worked hard, and I talked to a lot of people, and I asked them to trust me and to give me a chance to lead our nation. But it was a different thing, because I didn't like the way a lot of the tribal government policies were structured, and I wanted to change it, and the people I thought supported that. But it's a tough system. And I have a few more thoughts to share about that at the end, but it's something that's about, is it inside your tribe that's the most important place to be, or outside the tribe to try to influence the course of events going forward? Because it's a colonial system. I used to call it federal Indian control law, because it's not about some neutral thing, it's about control. And everything about the doctrine of discovery and the domestic dependent nationhood and the acts of Congress and the acts of Supreme Court are largely about what you can't do if you're a native people in a native government. And so it is about control. It's about regulating indigenous peoples. And I've never thought of it as neutral, or I've never thought about it as something that you should be simply studying for its intellectual value. It's a weapon. It's a tool that's used by the colonial legal system and the colonial society to control indigenous populations. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about, are some of the pros and cons of these different platforms of engagement. And maybe there are more opportunities and challenges, because I can't say at this point that it's really bright line. But a little bit about why should you engage within your indigenous community? And this might be a message that goes more towards Native people who are here, especially those in the university. Because I'll tell you, it's pretty comfortable in relative terms to live in this outside world. People generally respect you, they're nice to you, you can go get 16 different kinds of pizza if you want to, and going to your Indian reservation doesn't have a lot of that. It's a tough place to be almost everywhere in Indian country. So to leave this kind of life, and I was just telling a friend on the way over here, in the hotel that we're staying in right now, in 1987, when they were hiring first-year law students, second-year law students at Harvard, it was filled with American law firms looking to pay an awful lot of money for Harvard Law School talent. And the market was so unbelievably strong, it was unbelievably warping, that my first summer job was making 3 times as much money as my mother did as our education director. And I thought, frankly, to be honest with you, I really want to try that, you know, because I think it's important to understand what's going on in American law firms. Well, no, the money was good too. And so I learned a lot about that. And yet, what is it about tribal life? What's going on there? Well, from my perspective, that's where it begins. When you talk about the right of self-determination, when you talk about your sovereignty, when you talk about your existence as a Native people, it begins right there with the people. You can't manufacture that from Washington or Albany or anywhere else. If you're talking about the survival of your people, the strength of your people, it has to exist at that level where the people are. And maybe that's obvious, but you'd be surprised the degree to which there's some delusional thinking about somehow you can fix things from elsewhere. Some delusional thinking of which I've even engaged in. But much of it is that it has to be local. So you see it. When I got involved with a law reform project, one of my first things was to help change our Constitution to create a new Court of Appeal, to be able to separate our judicial elections from our general elections to try to de-escalate some of the politics of choosing judges. And at that time, in that window, no one else could do that for us in terms of trying to make things better for the people, the Seneca people, in terms of how we were governing ourselves. There's no federal official you can call. There's no NGO you can call. You can only do that yourself. So that's the upside. That's the attraction, is that you can actually see progress. And there's so many people on a day-to-day basis who work at Indian country tribal governments. Some of the toughest work that's done deals with children and families in distress. And they're people who make unbelievable sacrifices and deal with the most unbelievable tragedies oftentimes. But they're making a difference. They're finding a way to improve people's lives at the ground level. This isn't just a battle that occurs against a blank slate. We're inheriting this unbelievable legacy of colonization and the efforts that were taken by the American government in conspiracy with a lot of other actors in terms of this process to really destroy indigenous societies. So you have a lot of people like my family who were raised in boarding schools for which my grandmother was beaten as a small child because she was speaking the Seneca language. And that had a real consequence in terms of the degree to which my family maintained an inherent connection to our culture. And those have broader psychological effects, in the way people today are living and their health, their mental health, their physical health. Those experiences, we call it historic trauma. And it's something our healthcare professionals and our leaders are trying to work on, to find a way that you can't just give someone a pill or give them a Band-Aid if they're in pain. Sometimes you have to crawl into their intergenerational existence to find out what happened to them. And I don't know that that's completely true everywhere else in the world, but we're a colonized people. And these experiences of boarding schools and systematic efforts to destroy our societies require some very intimate, on-the-ground activity to improve it. So that's a reality of our lives, that self-determination, our sovereignty, our existence as a people happens at the local level, and you can't do it anywhere else. A related benefit, or at least important component to just tribal political engagement is the protection and defense function. How do you protect yourself if you're a tribal nation, a small tribal nation in the world? A few years ago, when I was teaching, I tried to get the law school administration to buy into the idea that I should teach a travel course over in Europe, and that I should go to the Vatican, and I should go to Monaco, and I should go to Liechtenstein to examine and explore how these small sovereigns of Europe sustain themselves. That I should go during the summer, and that I should have 3 weeks or so with my family, at the law school's expense, of course, to take a few students and understand and study these issues of these small sovereigns. They didn't buy it. But it's still an important question to ask, is how do those small sovereigns survive in the world as their own sovereigns? And so too with us. How do we make it? How do we survive? Well, we've had some great battles in my nation, as many nations do, but this really started me down the path of realizing that a lot of what we think about the way the law works is really a mistake, or at least, at best, it's misdirected. There's nothing in the treaties of the Seneca Nation or the Haudenosaunee, there's nothing in the legal system of my nation that says, we hereby consent to the plenary power of the United States. Now, American jurists, the Supreme Court, have been writing about that for generations. That American law is based upon this notion of plenary power, the doctrine of discovery. We've never embraced any of that. So guess what? It doesn't exist in our nation. And I actually wrote a whole article about how, frankly, American law is mostly advisory as it relates to the actions of a tribal government. If you're a tribal government which by treaty have consented to the application of American law to your business, and some tribes have, well, then you're stuck. But most have not. And that's called jurisprudential sovereignty. That's the ability to decide your own legal relationship with the United States. And so if you go back to whether it's the conflict zone with the state of New York over interpretation of our treaty right, our nation has as much right to interpret our treaties as we see fit, as does the state or the federal government. Sometimes they're in tension. Sometimes they're in conflict. But you don't resolve them by running to the courts of the United States. You settle them and resolve them through negotiation, if at all. It's a treaty. It's not meant to be legally adjudicated in the courts of one side over the other as a general matter. So we won some of these battles, not just the throughway thing, but something as sexy as making sure that the EPA cannot force you to get a federal permit for the construction of your wastewater treatment plant. Wastewater treatment sovereignty. Very important. But that's exactly what they did. My wife, when she was the president of our construction company, was working on the development of this important improvement in the wastewater treatment of our community. And the council had borrowed the money to be able to pay for it, and the EPA showed up and said, "You're going to get a permit." And we said, "No, we're not. We don't get permits from you to do business in our own land." Where in the treaty does it say this? So we fought with them for a couple of years over this. Now, keep in mind, no one was looking to pollute our own lands and waters. We had actually exceeded the standards that's set by the federal government, but it was the issue of the permit. And it took them a couple of years, but eventually we got a letter back that says, "We've decided to recognize your permit that the council issued for you. And we would like to sit down and have a discussion over maybe just a few refinements of that." Great, let's have a discussion. That was a big win. That was a big win, that with respect to business activities and governmental activities in our own territory, that we would not have to be subject to the environmental regulation of the United States. That was our business, and if the United States has an issue or problem, we'd be glad to talk about it. That's what sovereign nations do. So that's a perspective. And I see it from time to time, unfortunately, not often enough. And increasingly, the lawyers have grabbed hold of the issue and are reading from their provision of the US Code and are paving over their client's own freedom to make a different decision. I wrote a whole article about that too, not that anyone's ever read it, but it's just something that actually is rooted in the idea that when you're an American trained lawyer, you're largely not taught that there's an entire other legal system that you have to be respectful of and that you have to deal with. And frankly, if you're taking your ethical obligation seriously, you have to give life to that legal foundation, the tribal legal foundation, as much as you do the American legal foundation. So a little bit of the downside of the tribal life, the tribal political life, the tribal engagement life. And I saw this for those of you who are ever working in tribal government and decide, I think I want to run for chair, or I want to run for president. Your world goes from seeing things in black and white to seeing things in unbelievable technicolor and vibrancy. It's much more complicated, much harder than you could ever imagine. And I have so much respect for the tribal leaders in place today and in the past and those yet to come, because it's really hard to govern a tribal nation. There's so many different interests, there's so many different problems, and I think that the intensity of the politics, for those of you who've ever been on a city council, or maybe the standard is, if your constituents actually know where you live, then you know how hard it is to be a political leader. I mean, these guys in Washington, these women that travel in and they do their business and they leave, that's great. It's when they go back home where people know where they live that it gets tough, because then you've got to deal with folks on your doorstep and at the supermarket, and tribal communities are very same way. And they're generally, as my experience, Native people are not shy about telling you what's wrong with what you're doing in terms of your responsibilities. And I think taking that dynamic and then adding in the fact that the reality in most cases, and certainly the perception, is that political rewards, political economic engagement is a zero-sum game. That I can only win if you lose. And that might be true generally, not just in Native communities, but there's an awful lot of really intense conflict. Jobs, contracts, economic activity that is being sought by some, it's at the expense of somebody else. And the reality is that in many places in Indian country, that's really still true, where most of the dollars come from federal appropriations. There are no new jobs being created. There are no new dollars flowing into the community. And I didn't realize that when I had tried to bring in well, not just myself historically, but other people from our community, the children and grandchildren who had gotten their college degrees, try to bring them into our government. It was perceived by many, and to some extent it was true, it was a zero-sum game because those jobs didn't go to people who may not have been qualified for those jobs. And it was very contentious. It's very hard business to have to make those decisions. So with that exciting news, let's move on to engaging with the colonial political system. Because as much as there are strengths and weaknesses, when your political system is intertwined with the United States, in some cases it's very, very direct. There are many Indian nations and tribes in the United States that have constitutions that require that the Secretary of the Interior approve their laws, approve the amendments to their constitutions. This is not a federal legal requirement by any means, but it is a symptom, a consequence of those early Indian Reorganization Act governments where the bureaucrats embedded these provisions in the tribal constitutional drafts that were being proposed, where they embedded themselves in the power structure. And so you're dealing literally with this intertwining of politics and law between the tribal and the federal government over control over what's going on. I worked with a tribe on trying to change their constitution to remove these provisions because there is no federal requirement for them. And a tribe, if it wants to get rid of the Secretary of the Interior from its ordinance approval and from its constitutional approval process, can do that. Well, the bureaucrats don't often like that, and it took 7 years of advocacy and patience and fighting with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to get their constitution, to get their election approved so they could remove those provisions from the tribe. So the government sometimes just doesn't want to let go. And that's part of the challenge, is that when you engage with that system, you've got to find a way to make a difference. So I think that's really one of the first and most important reasons to get involved in what's going on in the federal government, is that it gives you an opportunity to repair and fix some of the historic colonial activities of the United States as it relates to Native peoples. I thought John Dossett earlier did a really great job highlighting a variety of different statutes and initiatives. And if you were to go back through you could do a law review article about each one of them, about the degree to which those statutes, like the Violence Against Women Act, for example, that are designed to repair colonial intrusions, the deprivation of jurisdiction of tribal governments over non-Indians, repairing the degree to which Native women primarily are victimized within their own communities by non-Indian men. That this is about repairing and fixing some of the problems that exist with the Native communities, maybe most, if not all, but it's being done at the level of the United States government, where you're thinking, we can't solve the problem by ourselves on the ground, we have to go to Washington because we need to fix those laws that are in place in order to repair this fix this problem. So that's why I think that when you talk about maybe reorienting the agenda of the United States, it's really a matter, and I think Richard Guest brought this out in his presentation, it's about the trajectory of how federal policy has changed. It was only 50 years ago that the formal Indian policy of the United States was called termination. We're going to terminate indigenous people as separate people. And it really started with the Citizenship Act of 1924. And I should tell you now, I'm definitely, along with most of the members of my nation, opposed to the idea that we should be voting in American elections. Because citizenship was not given to us as some notion of liberating our political existence. It was a tool of assimilation and oppression to make sure that we were absorbed into the American polity at the expense of our tribal sovereignty. And it boils down to the fact that a nation does not enter into treaties with its own people. And I heard it from folks that if you vote, if you participate at that level in the American political system, then what you're really doing is you're jumping to the other side. And then there was no one left to speak for the treaty Indians. The reason why I know that's true to some extent is that that's what the adversaries of sovereignty say. You're all citizens now. And the minute that Congress did that, your treaty rights disappeared. So it's something to be very concerned about. And I respect that different Native people and different tribal governments make different decisions about what's best for how to articulate their view forward. But it's something, at least in our nations, we generally don't do. That doesn't mean we don't engage. And diplomats, it's kind of lobbying. John pointed out lobbying. It's, diplomacy, right? We're on diplomatic missions when we go to Washington and we go to Albany to deal with other diplomatic representatives, like members of Congress and senators. And there's a way to make progress. And I think it's really great that there is progress being made on a number of these different issues. And that's kind of, back to the experiment, what I have really been trying to do the last 3 years since I left office, is to be involved with some major battles to protect and defend the sovereignty and the freedom of our nations. John had mentioned in his presentation, which I thought I wanted to just take a little bit more time, is a recent battle that related to protecting Native people and the benefits that tribal governments provide to Native people from the IRS, the Tribal Government General Welfare Exclusion Act. And this was something that I was lucky enough to work on behalf of one of my clients. But if you can believe it, right, for 10 years, the IRS was auditing tribes, auditing individual Indians, forcing tribal governments to give 1099s to elders for their hip replacements. Pay tax, granny. That's what the IRS was saying. And that's what was happening. And no one talks about their audits. So this was kind of going on for 10 years, that there was this, well, oh, you got audited too? You're getting audited? We got audited twice. And when you started piecing it together, Native leaders were realizing this was a systematic problem, that kind office over at the IRS that was trying to help us with our payroll tax records was actually in the business of auditing us. So the first mobilization occurred with respect to the Affordable Care Act, and tribal health care benefits were immunized. And that was a big win. And then the whole process was really taken to the complete level that we need to fix this problem for all benefits. As tribal governments have the responsibility to serve Native people, have the resources to serve Native people, tribal governments should not be subject to tax, income tax, nor should their people, for the benefits that are being provided. And so there was a two-pronged process going on in 2013 and 2014. One was engaging directly with IRS to try to push them to develop their own policies, and the other to pursue legislation, to go to the Congress. And there's a certain internal debate and discussion about building coalitions, about finding a way to sort through what's the right policy approach to take. It's a democratic process. There are tribes all over the country, tribal organizations, that are constantly working on a number of different issues. But we were able to get focus. We all agree we should stop and find a way to protect ourselves from the IRS. And we found members of Congress totally willing to help us do that. And it was a big win. We ultimately got a bill through the Congress, no hearings, no real votes, voice vote, both houses. And I think that's where, you see the power. I mean, it wasn't quite Seneca's on the highway, but to me it was. It was, we got a bill through the Congress. This will protect Native people forever by having it in the tax code that the IRS cannot tax the benefits that our governments provide. And so it makes a difference. Exciting that when you can do things that will make a difference for Indian people in Washington, you want to hang on to it and embrace it, because it can and will happen if you're an optimist. A couple thoughts on just the downside of this system. The level of hostility to tribal sovereignty is something that you may be familiar with, but depending upon where you are in America, it starts with gross ignorance about what tribal sovereignty is and what treaties are. It blends in a little bit to the casino confusion. Well, you all have casinos now and have all the money, so why do you need to have federal appropriations dollars? And that's just such a wrong-headed, skewed, misinformed perspective, because most places in Indian country remain unbelievably impoverished and have not had the benefit of tremendous gaming wealth. But that influences it, and it's something that really is a part of the way in which a lot of Americans still think, and their officials still think, about what's going on in Indian country. And I think, frankly, some folks are fairly informed. They're very educated about tribal sovereignty. They just hate it. They just think it's wrong that there should be such a thing as separate sovereign tribal nations within the United States. And there are groups and there are members of Congress who, in their own way, do what they can to undermine that and to oppose us when it comes to the preservation of our nations. I don't like to talk oftentimes publicly too much about what's going on in the American elections, but we are very much at the cusp of an unbelievable wave of American nationalism that we haven't seen since World War II, which ushered in the termination era. And if you look at the historical parallels, I think, as Native people, we have to be very concerned about what's happened in the American political election this time around. Because among other things, is it really going to be the case that we're going to have the same level of respect of our treaty rights, of our lands, of our governments? I'd be very worried about that, and I think that we should be aware of the historical parallels, that the last time something like this happened, it was it began the termination era. So these are somewhat general thoughts about where to engage. So the question might be, to sort of start to close here, is, all right, so it's been 30 years since I got out of law school, or since I started law school, and I'm still working on it, in terms of this experiment about where best to engage. So I would say, as a general matter, clearly both. I mean, you need to have people on the ground, in the community, within the tribal government, working hard to make things better. And I'm a little worried about that for my own tribe and maybe all tribes. Because one of the things about being colonized by Americans is that the American way of life is rooted in a certain aspiration of happiness and freedom, personal freedom. It's not, really an ethos that's rooted in, you should sacrifice and suffer to be an American citizen. It's just the opposite. And I think a lot of folks, it's easy to be drawn into that. TV sends us these messages, the media, and to say, well, I want to go work with my tribal nation, which is not always fun and which is hard to do, and it doesn't have 16 different kinds of pizza nearby, is not a really fun life sometimes. But if you don't do it, especially those of you who are natives, those of you who have a role, even if you're not native, there's roles to play. If there's nobody on the ground of strength and means and fortitude and virtue, then our governments will wither away and they'll die off. And we will be left to the forces that would seek our destruction. So who knows whether I'll ever get back involved. I really don't think it'll ever happen. I feel like I've paid in my dues, and I know my family feels the same way. But I think it's an important point to focus on. And I think with respect to the American political system, I mean, it's changed. It's so different. Even gaming. The last time the government really even studied the question, say, of our economies was during the Reagan administration. And so there's a lot to be done yet about improving economy, about finding ways to help tribal governments deal with what's happening within our nations. Focus. If you're going to be involved in either direction, you have to focus on what your task is. You can easily be distracted and drawn into all kinds of different agendas. There's a lot of folks who talk, not a lot of people who get things done. And if you want to be involved, you really need to want to get things done. Stay disciplined, stay focused. And sometimes that's hard, and I tend to think that, I really think that my legal training has helped me a lot over the years in terms of helping focus and really laser in on particular problems in a way that might help get things done. Work hard. And this was mentioned earlier too, about working hard, about finding a way to focus on the task. There are people out there who shame me in terms of their work ethic. It's unbelievable. Leaders especially who've been in place in some cases for decades, dealing with all of these challenges. I don't know how they do it. But thank goodness that they do, because there's so many challenges that this effort, and that's not always the case. I was just reading the other day that the current generation is having a hard time holding on to their investment bank jobs on Wall Street because it's kind of boring and it's really hard work, and gosh, that $150,000 or $200,000 a year just isn't that much, to hang on to those jobs. And that's a real message. I was reading that somewhat shocked. So doing things where it's not always the most lucrative, where it's somewhat of a challenge is really important. But if you work hard at it, you can really achieve tremendous goals. So as I conclude, I want to just maybe bring this all together and just offer a suggestion on what might be the most important thing that we could be working on. And I think it's controversial for some, but at the moment it's where I think it's important. And that's improving tribal economies. Our economies have been devastated. And I start from the assumption that all Native people were rich, that we were wealthy, that we lived within the land, we lived within our resources, we lived within our people. We fought and had conflict with each other, but we had what we needed, and we had the notion that this was a good life. And most of that has been taken away, confiscated, stolen, whether it's the IRS taking our money because they think we're citizens of the United States, whether it's development companies looking to gain title and resources to tribal lands, whether it's folks up in Alaska who had the entire country but ended up with only 10% of it and just a small fraction of the wealth. These economies have been destroyed. And when you talk about how best to help people, it invariably comes back to whether they have the money to do anything about it. Whether it's fully implementing the powers under the Violence Against Women Act in your tribal courts, whether it's helping your elders or dealing with children in distress. If you don't have dollars, if the tribal government doesn't have dollars to be able to find a doctor, to find a care provider, to find some way, then tribal governments can't help. And you can't wait around. So some of the folks that I work have largely been saying if the federal government can't give us the dollars that we're entitled to, I love Karen's notion that we were already sort of prepaid, so where's our money? If you can't pay up, give us our freedom back. Get your regulators out of our pocket. Get your tax man out of our pocket. Give us the control that we need over our lands, and then we'll find a way to create businesses, create jobs, and do what we can to help our tribal people have a better life. And so at the moment, that's where I'm at, in terms of helping to find ways for Native people, Native governments, entrepreneurs, create jobs, find revenue, change federal laws that inhibit growth. John's argument or presentation on the Indian Trader Statutes, a fairly unsexy statute in the annals of federal statutes, the one that said all the non-Indians had to have a license before they could do business with the Indians, can actually be a great tool to protect us from ill-gotten gains going to the state and local governments. And we can preserve those dollars for ourselves. It's not sexy sometimes, but it's really important, I think, that we find a way to help tribal governments and Native people restore economy so that then they can make the choices that they need with the dollars that they generate to repair some of the mistakes that have been made, some of the agendas that have been inflicted on us, and ultimately to pursue the goal and lifeblood of the people that they represent. So I want to thank you for your time, Nyawe, and I want to be able to share with you any further thoughts on this now or later, but thank you again for the opportunity to be here. Nyawe.
Thank you. Do Q&A right here.
Okay, sure.
Hello. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You spoke a lot about having great economic viability for these different tribes. How do you think the tribes using their resources to generate those profits needed to pay for the programs they need can factor into that goal?
How do they need to do it? Well, I don't know of any tribal nation that has a tax base of any significance. There are a few tribes that collect taxes, but the basic business model in the American state and federal local governments is that you tax income, you tax businesses, you tax property. And that doesn't exist within any country as a general matter. So tribes run businesses, casinos being the most significant and prominent, but could be a grocery store, could be a gas station.
In terms of natural resources like wood or timber, what do you think that would factor into it?
Well, I think that there's an increasing recognition that renewables are better. There are many that don't have renewables, and much of their economy sometimes is based upon hard rock mining and other business activity that exists really everywhere in the world. My nation, for many, many years, probably was kept afloat by gravel mining in our territory. And eventually we've had some recent debates over a moratorium on that because we just don't think we should be doing it anymore. So sovereignty sometimes manifests itself in behaviors that you may not like, but a tribe has authority with respect to its own territory to do what it sees best for itself, and that may include that kind of development.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Hi, I'm Ann Flaherty. I teach political science at Merrimack College, and I also grew up in upstate New York and watched the 1992 conflict unfold. So I was glad you mentioned it. But in recent years, the state of New York has gone back to attempting to assert its right to tax cigarette sales on reservations. And it's not just New York, it's other states too. So my question was, how can states and tribes forge a more cooperative relationship when there's ongoing conflicts like that?
Well, it depends on finding good-hearted folks, good-minded folks within the state government. And again, in an effort to solve problems, sometimes it's just ignorance. And the way dollars flow, rarely in a tribal nation does the dollar flow more than once. It comes in and then it's immediately leaving the territory. Grocery store, car dealership, whatever. And when you realize that, and we did that in my nation, we did an economic study, and we demonstrated that through direct employment, through contractors, and through other economic stimulus, we were contributing over $1 billion to the regional economy, which is an awful lot of non-Indians who became taxpayers. A non-Indian employee at the casino who has enough money to buy a house is paying property tax, they're paying sales tax on their purchases, they're paying tax on their income because they have a job. And I think for a lot of folks that I saw from the time I was first in tribal office in the early 90s, just a dozen years later when we had the casinos, educating these folks and making them realize it's a win-win. Every time a tribal nation has land that's not subject to tax and turns it into something productive, it helps everybody. And I think that's the path forward, is hopefully finding good-minded, good-hearted folks in state government who can appreciate that it's a win-win.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Leland Pacheco Morrill. I'm Navajo in Santo Domingo Pueblo. And I kind of want to address the Cobell Agreement, which also is kind of supersedes the land buyback program, which is part of the Dawes Act, which is, 120 years ago, 150 years ago. And then also the Nebraska versus Parker, where the Omaha tribe did actually win, but that was actually based on alcohol tax, and then it was redrawing the lines of the actual property of a reservation system in Nebraska. Now, both of those aspects of it, one of them is to try to reconnect fractionated lands, and the only reason why I even know about this is because the Navajo tribe actually came to Los Angeles to an urban setting to actually talk to natives in Los Angeles regarding the land buyback program, because so many of them own land on a reservation that they don't live in. And so, but the land buyback program was introduced kind of to give back an economy back to fractionated land, but also then you have the Nebraska Parker case that was trying to take away land. Do you have any comments on those at all?
I feel like this is kind of Jeopardy, where I'm getting asked, please form your answer in a question. You have touched upon a whole array of after effects of, again, the colonization agenda, all these fractionated reservations and all these divided land interests. And it's really pretty straightforward. You can't really do much with land that you don't have jurisdiction over. So, the current administration really should get a lot of applause for channeling resources into allowing tribes to reacquire these lands within their territory so they can self-govern and they can find a way. But it's a long process. I mean, in some cases, you have hundreds of ostensible owners of parcels of land. And on 2 occasions, the Supreme Court has invalidated efforts by the Congress to allow those lands to be consolidated back into the power of the tribe. So it's a very hard thing. But it also raises a bigger question, which might be, what's the source of economic opportunity for tribal nations? I was literally at a conference a couple of days ago having a conversation with a tribal leader, and I said, well, you realize that the income earned by a tribal government anywhere in America, including off territory, is immune from income tax. Didn't know that. So what that means is that there are potential business opportunities for a tribal nation off territory, for which, at minimum, there's no income tax for the benefit of the tribe. That's a pretty significant advantage. in relation to other businesses. So I think your question's a great one. It's an unbelievably complicated issue, but there are efforts, as you've since heard, about how to solve it. Okay, yeah.
Hi, my name is Karina Kesselman. I'm a lawyer in Quebec, Canada. And you talked about treaties and interpretation of treaties and jurisdiction over treaties.
Yes.
And I'd like to know if, in your opinion, a treaty can be unilaterally repealed by one of the parties.
I think the answer is yes. Because it's a treaty, it's an agreement. And it isn't necessarily that we like Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, which says that you can abrogate an Indian treaty, but my own people seriously debated that during our '92 war. Should we actually go back to pre-treaty conditions? Warfare. It was a debate, and we didn't do it. But there was actually, what would happen if we did? And so I don't know if there will ever be circumstances in the future where that matters, but it's an agreement. And I suppose if you really take agreement seriously, you have to respect the sovereignty of both governments to that treaty.
Rob,
Okay,
thank you
that's
so
it.
much.
All right.
That was fantastic. Thank you. That was great.